Hi, and welcome to Guardians of Salesforce, the podcast where we cut through the noise to talk honestly about securing Salesforce in the real world. Hello, my name is Graham Smith, and today we're talking about Salesforce security assessments, what they are, why they're important, and the types of problems that they can highlight and solve. I can't do that alone, so I'm delighted to be joined by Doug Merrett from Platinum 7. I've known Doug for a number of years. He's a partner of ours at WithSecure, and we have a number of shared customers. And his expertise doesn't just extend to Salesforce security. Earlier this year, I was traveling to Sydney World Tour, and he showed me around Melbourne, which is where he lives, showing me all of the museums and the street art of Melbourne. So he's a man of many talents. So Doug, welcome. And perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit more about Platinum 7.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Really appreciate it. Platinum 7 was formed in 2021. I decided to start this business up after being at Salesforce for 13 years. I used to be a platform security expert in the Salesforce team, both in the UK and then back home here in Australia. And I used to educate customers around how Salesforce does what Salesforce does when it comes to security. And one of the questions was normally then, well, that's excellent, but who can get to help me? And that was always a bit of a difficult answer because not all partners are security specialists. So I decided to open up Platinum 7 just to do one thing and one thing only, look at Salesforce security, and that's it.
Yeah, perfect. That's a really needed function, and one that I think we'll dig into in a bit more detail today. So let's dive straight in. What are Salesforce security assessments, Doug, and why are they important?
Well, there are a number of different things that you could do for a Salesforce security assessment. I mean, Salesforce has the health check, which you get as part of the standard licenses inside your Salesforce org. So you can run that. It'll give you the low-hanging fruit and give you some things to look at, which is always very useful. Everything you think about security is good. So there's nothing wrong with doing the health check. It's perfectly useful. And if you get a good score on that, at least you know you're on the way to getting a solid environment. Salesforce recently purchased the Own backup company, and they had a product called Own Secure. And Own Secure has its own little assessment tool built into it as well, which looks at Salesforce security through 6 different lenses, and it gives you a score which you can then over time see if it gets better over time or worse. Hopefully not worse. Hopefully it is better. And that's a really powerful feature which I think people should look at in the Salesforce Security Center space. But then there's also third-party assessments like what I do here at Platinum 7. So I spend about a week gathering data from your Salesforce environment, looking at all the metadata, looking at login history, looking at permissions and profiles and lots of other interesting things. And from that, I can give you guidance around what I see issues in your org when it comes to security, and then give you some guidance on how to solve those problems.
Yeah, that's helpful. And looking back to those out-of-the-box features, and then you talked about Own Secure, in your experience, are customers actually using these features, and are they using them well or not?
Even though the Salesforce Health Check is free and included in the setup area, very, very few customers that I know actually have run it, because if I go to do an assessment, that's one of the outputs that go into my findings. And a lot of customers obviously haven't run it because they've got a lot of issues in the health check, which are very simple to fix. So I don't think people are aware of security as much as they probably should be. Okay,
and that's at a pretty basic level that perhaps there are some gaps. So what are the common problems and perhaps some of the more serious problems that you unearth when you run security assessments for your customers?
The major one I find is that if you have Salesforce digital experiences, or what used to be called communities, or even before then, portals, if you have one of those environments, of my customers that have them, over 60% of those customers actually had misconfigured it in a way which was not good for security. And of those ones that misconfigured it, more than half had misconfigured it in a way which was so easy for anybody to actually see everyone else's data in that particular environment, which is not what you want. And so that is probably the biggest risk for people who don't have digital experiences or communities. There are also other issues I bring up all the time. Things like, for example, having integrations coming into your version of Salesforce running a system administrator, because that means you're giving that external third party full control over your Salesforce org, where they could change they could deactivate users, they could give people different permissions, they could shut people out, they could export all the data they wanted, etc. So it's really quite dangerous to let external third-party applications connect to system admin. Other things as well, which are interesting, I consider to be a critical finding, even though some people may not, is that not having a backup. Not having a backup, I consider to be a critical finding, because Salesforce does backup to keep the whole service running. So if the instance you're on goes pop, they can automatically fail over and make it work somewhere else. But if you upload some data and accidentally have a data corruption, their backup is not going to help you. So having your own backup where you can restore stuff is actually quite important. So there are obviously misconfigurations that I consider to be critical, but also lack of product is also something I consider to be critical as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And practically, you talked about sort of applications and perhaps the number of admin users that you've got within an org. You always tell me that should be a number trending towards 2. So what are some of the horror stories that you've seen? How many admins have you found within an enterprise org that's perhaps mature and, this is a Salesforce environment that's 5 or 10 years old perhaps?
I did an assessment for a customer who has many thousands of users. They have about 3,500 users using an ISV application, and then they had about 180 to 200 other users who weren't using that application, and every single one of them was an admin.
Wow.
Yeah.
So hundreds of admins shouldn't have been there, really.
Which shouldn't have been there, exactly. And they're correcting that. Actually, they knew that was an issue before they got me to do the assessment, but even so, I was a little bit surprised when I found it. But that's key. I think the number of system admins should be a number trending towards 2. 3 and 5, I think, is fair for most organizations, because people go on holidays, that sort of stuff, it makes sense. But basically, if you have too many, it means you're probably not controlling access to your org as well as you probably should do.
Yeah, that's clear. And so you talked about lack of awareness, and that's really people. So who should be involved in the Salesforce security assessment, perhaps from the Salesforce and the security teams of a particular organization?
It's always good if the security team actually are part of it, because most security teams that I know of don't actually know much about Salesforce at all. And so having a general education session with them is actually quite useful to get them up to speed. But then obviously the practitioners inside the company that run the Salesforce environment, they need to be there as well, obviously, to hear the things that I find. And one of the key things is the findings that I give to my customers aren't necessarily, oh my God, you've got to fix what I tell you to fix. They're more around, this is something I consider to be not best practice. And if you've made a conscious decision to do that, understand the risks of doing it, and are happy with that, that's fine. Don't change it. You've made a decision to do that. That's not a problem, because everyone uses the Salesforce environment in a different way. So I'm just highlighting things that I consider to be not best practice. So if you decided that you want to have 150 admins and you're cool with that, that's fine. Leave it alone. It's no problem at all.
Yeah, I think that's clear. And for me, it's that lack of awareness, or the company hasn't done that thinking. One of the qualification questions I ask of typically a Salesforce team member who I might see at a Salesforce event is, if you had a security problem, who would you call? And whether that organization is small or a large enterprise one, often there's not clarity on who that person is. Yes, they have a security team. Yes, they have a CISO that's ultimately responsible for security, but are they responsible for Salesforce security? Have they performed a security assessment for that org in the last 6 or 12 months? Often the answer is no, and I think you're right. That's where risk can emerge, particularly if the Salesforce environment is changing and evolving constantly, which we find many of them are. There you go, Jug.
No, sorry, I totally agree. And one of the things which I do consider to be quite important is that a lot of the time Salesforce actually is purchased in the department level, and sometimes IT and security aren't even involved. So it may have just been a secret squirrel project behind the scenes, but then it's become actually very well used. And that is how Salesforce sometimes turns up in companies. So the security folks may not even know it's there in the first place, but then they find wind of it and they need to do something about it. So this is where I think putting some scrutiny across your Salesforce environment when it comes to what's being stored in it, how is it being managed, how are you controlling risk. That's something that normal Salesforce people don't normally think about because they're trying to solve a business problem. They're trying to keep the business running and make it work. And that's perfectly good, perfectly sensible. You need to have two lenses across your Salesforce environment, I think.
100%. And I think Salesforce's success is that it is a business application that provides tangible business value. And you're right, in those instances where it's bought by the business and IT and then security is maybe somewhat removed from that, that's where risk can emerge. They can add value. They would want to help with Salesforce deployments, making sure that they're secure on an ongoing basis. But if they're not part of that discussion, not part of that project team, then that risk often exists. So yes, I think that's what we see commonly happening with these large Salesforce environments. And so once you've performed a security assessment and you've identified some risk or some areas where the customer's not following best practice, what's a good response plan? How do you help customers to remedy these types of things? And what are customers doing to remedy the things that you're highlighting?
The majority of the remediations are actually, I put them in the bottom of the findings. So part of my assessment is what's the description around what the issue is, like having system admins being API users. And then I have the actual specifics around your particular org. So you've got these particular system admins who are being used by these particular applications. Then I'll put a business risk area in, a technical risk area, and then a remediation section. And that remediation section covers off how you can solve that problem. And in general, it doesn't involve me getting involved to actually remediate for you. The vast majority of remediation should be done by the local internal team, if you've got one, or with your partner who actually supports your business, because you know the business, you understand you understand the layout of the application, you understand why it's being used the way it is. So basically what you should be doing is using that team to actually do that work. So I just give guidance around what you should look at doing. And most of the time, customers are self-sufficient in solving that problem. Occasionally want me to come and just give them a bit of assistance on the first one, maybe. Like, for example, I suggest people should be using the Salesforce integration user license versus a real license to actually do the integrations. And moving from what you already have to the new way could be a little bit challenging for the first one. So I'm very happy to help with the first one and then let them do the rest themselves with maybe telephone call here and there. But in general, it's done by the local team.
Yes, and there's been a lot of publicity around Salesforce integrations. Salesforce does offer some free licenses that customers could take advantage of. Do you want to describe a little bit more about that, perhaps?
Yeah, so the system integration licenses came out a couple of years ago now, and everybody gets 5 of them for free. Mm-hmm. And they're only $120 per annum if you want to buy more. So they're relatively inexpensive compared to a full Salesforce license. And they do have some restrictions. They can't be used for every integration, but they can be used for the vast majority of integrations out there. And best practice is you have one user per integration, which means you can really tie that user down to only give that application access to just the data it needs to have to do its work.
Yeah, that's really good advice, particularly right now, I'm sure. So we can't have a conversation about Salesforce in 2025, Doug, without talking about Agentforce and AI. What impact is that going to have on Salesforce security and perhaps has already had on the assessments that you're performing for your customers?
It's a two-edged question, I think, in that respect, Graham. And the first one is around what do you need to do to make sure your environment is ready for Agentforce? And really just getting the foundations right first is key. So getting your data sharing rules, getting your visibility set up properly, making sure you've got the appropriate configuration done is key. And then you can implement AI on top really well, because if you don't have good data under the covers, you're not going to have a great AI experience. And the second side is, what does Agentforce can do for security? Well, Salesforce are doing some things right now that have agents looking at the configuration, actually giving you guidance around what you should be doing. This is currently in a pilot. It's not out there yet, but I think that's something which is quite useful and will be very useful in the future. And another thing which is happening at the moment is that the data from Salesforce Event Monitoring, which is an add-on package, is able to be fed into Data Cloud. And Data Cloud is where the AI systems live. And that means that you're able to use AI for what it's really good at, which is pattern matching and pattern searching and that type of thing. So you'll be able to do behavioral analytics upon the data. So instead of having a rule that says if you do more than 17 of these things, it's bad, you could say what's normal. And then if someone exceeds that normal by 15%, then it's bad, and that type of thing. And normal is per user, not per group or per company. It's what does Doug do on a daily basis? And if Doug does something a bit weird, then that should be flagged.
Yes, I agree with that. I was at Dreamforce and saw Salesforce's recent announcements where they're using AI, I think for the most part, to make sense of security events happening in Salesforce and then make suggestions to how to remedy things or to highlight things that could be a risk. And I think that's super important. If you're a Salesforce admin and you're not a security professional, having AI telling you this user's using Salesforce perhaps in a slightly different way than historical norms, and you might want to look into that. That's fantastic because that helps that Salesforce professional and potentially just to get on the phone to their security equivalent and look into that incident and perhaps mitigate a threat that's very real within the platform. So I think that you're right that use of AI has some real practical benefits as we move into this world of AI and agents. So I think that's important. And looking at advice, sort of further advice for Salesforce users, what practical tip would you give to a Salesforce or security professional right now? What tips could they make to mitigate risk on the platform? Some easy wins, perhaps.
Easy wins, I think, are around the connected applications that everyone's been hearing about in the press recently. Salesforce have done a great job of responding to that threat and locking down anybody trying to access the Salesforce environment with a new connected app that doesn't be connected before. So that's great. However, everybody who used one of those connected apps in the past that's not been installed can still use it. So it's grandfathered in. So things don't break. However, you really should go back and look at every connected application you have, work out, is it actually still being used? Is it actually going to give you business value? If it hasn't been used for 6 years and it's still connected, why is it there? And so you should be blocking or installing all of your connected apps and just controlling access to your org as much as possible. Look at your integrations and try and remove system admins from that particular process, and run the Salesforce health check. Just have a look at that and see what it gives you in the top group of findings, and see if you're doing well or not so much, and then work on those.
Yeah, that's great advice. So final question from me today, Doug, is that there have been some high-profile breaches related to Salesforce recently. What's your take on this? And I guess perhaps an even more pointed question is the shared responsibility model fit for purpose now?
That's a very interesting question, because the issue that happened at all of those companies, and I'm not going to list them off, but there's quite a few very large companies out there and people that you'd be quite surprised actually do use Salesforce. But anyway, these companies, it wasn't technically a Salesforce issue. It was a shared responsibility issue where the customer didn't do what they could have done to keep their data safe. That being said, it was about education as well. And I think, yes, the shared responsibility model is very important. But I think also customers need to understand they've got to do a bit of research and a bit of study. And Salesforce need to also improve, in my opinion, and be a little bit more opinionated on what they say around things. They've got some great documentation, but it always says, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. What it should say is, best practices, do this. Mm-hmm. And I think being a bit more opinionated would be a good idea on Salesforce's front. But customers also need to understand that just because Salesforce is a remarkably secure platform, and it is, they've got some skin in the game as well. They've got to make sure they configure it appropriately to keep themselves safe. But I think shared responsibility is very important, and it's there for everybody who uses a software service, be it Amazon or Google or Microsoft or Salesforce. When you have a shared responsibility model, it is really there, and having a good demarcation, understanding where that line is key. And I think if you talk to your Salesforce sales rep, they'll be very happy to get one of the security team to talk to you around what bits do you have to look after.
That's really clear. Sounds like you see the theory of the shared responsibility model really still existing. I think I agree with that. And certainly what seems to be clear is that cybersecurity, particularly on Salesforce, is a team sport. So Salesforce has a role to play. So does the customers. There's also partners out there on the App Exchange, or implementation partners, or even, security experts like Platinum 7. So I think that's really shows that it is a shared responsibility, and it needs some investigation and some assessment to get to the good security outcomes that every customer wants on the platform. So a good positive way to end, I'm sure. All that remains for me to say is thanks, Doug. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with me today. I know that I did. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider subscribing to it on your chosen platform, or giving it a review, or even just tell a colleague or someone in your network about the podcast's existence. It really helps us to grow our audience. So to find out more about Doug, you can check out his website, which is platinum7.com.au. All that remains for me to say is goodbye, and thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Thanks very much. Appreciate being on the call as well. Have a great day.
Thanks very much for joining. Until next time, goodbye.